Are we? All right, there we go. Say, hi everyone. My name's Jacob Smith. I see some familiar faces throughout the week. I see some new faces, which is always an awesome thing. Today is Friday, the last day of our lecture series, if that's what you want to call it. Tuesday, we talked about the Korean War era experience. Wednesday was Vietnam. Thursday is what we called modern. Today is our last day, and we're ending on Gold Star. And if anyone doesn't know what Gold Star is, Gold Star spouse, Gold Star mother, you can even have a Gold Star brother, sister, grandparents. And what that is it's a family member that has lost a service member while they were in service. It could be that they died training-wise, or it could be that they died in combat. The young lady right here, Kimberly Hazelgrove, a veteran in her own right, a Sergeant First Class, her husband, Brian Hazelgrove, died while in Iraq. So how we're going to do this, for those of you that have been with us this week, oh, by the way, this is not to dismiss Ken. This is Ken Lane. He is a U.S. Navy veteran. He's what you call a Mustang. And a Mustang, for those of you who don't know, are people that are enlisted. They go in enlisted, and then they go to the dark side and become officers. Hey, you get your money's worth here. At any rate, I have had the pleasure of knowing Kimberly now for a few years, more than a few years. And Ken, I met, last year or year before, when he started working as a veteran service officer at the Lorain County Veteran Service Commission. Ken is an unbelievable service officer and knows, and I will say this, I've been working with veterans for about 14 years. When it comes to the intricacies of claims, Ken knows more, has forgotten more than I've ever learned. So how we're going to do this is she's going to start off for about a half hour, talk specifically about Gold Star, her transition from military service. As I said yesterday, when her husband died, she lost her career too. So she's going to get into that. Then about 30, 35, 40 minutes, she will wrap up. And then we will do the interviews like we have been doing over the past few days. So today's probably going to go to about 12 o'clock. So thank you. And Kimberly, you want to take?
Good morning, everybody. And I just want to say thank you so much to Lakeside Chautauqua for having me here today and taking the opportunity to learn a little bit about my experience and, most importantly, the journey that a lot of surviving families go through. In my particular instance, like Jacob said, I was also serving active duty alongside my husband. And so I had an extra layer of complexity through my experience. In some ways was very good because I had military knowledge and I could utilize that to change systems and change experiences for surviving families and improve services. And also as a civilian, civilian spouses don't necessarily have that, even though if anybody here was a military spouse, they understand that you serve right alongside your member who is serving active duty. So I always like to know who I'm speaking to. So in the audience, if you could raise your hand, who has served in the military? Thank you for your service. As any women or men have been married to the military? All right. Thank you for your service as well. Like Jacob said, I did serve in the U.S. Army. I went in and signed up around 1996. I grew up on a farm all the way in Ashtabula, Ohio, which is way east, almost into Pennsylvania. But I grew up as a tomboy and had probably a lot more testosterone than normal young ladies from working the farm and lifting hay bales, and just my experiences growing up, I just always felt more comfortable in male-dominated environments. And that's kind of what led me on that path to military service. So none of us, and no matter what we do in life, have one role, right? There's not just one thing that we do, not one thing we are known for. So I started off in the military as an E2, and throughout my experience rising to E7, you know, I had to be better than the men. I had to be better shooters than the guys. I had to be a better leader than the guys, and I knew I needed to know how to play the game. So in 9.5 years, I made it to E7. I was a daughter. I was a soldier. I became a wife. My husband and I got married, met in the military at Fort Campbell, and we also got married when we both went to South Korea. So we would come back home married. You know, a cousin, friend, but also a student. I was able through re-enlisting from my initial service period, was able to go to school and try to get some credits while I was in, because that would help me get promoted, and it would also help me to anything that I wanted to do after the service. So this is our family at the time. This picture was taken 3 weeks before my husband deployed to Iraq, and it was his first deployment. I had just returned from my own deployment in support of global war on terrorism. I was sent to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and I was only part of the second ever joint task force that ended up there, so very early after 9/11. In fact, the young boy who is sitting in the middle of us there, he was barely a year old. He wasn't even a year old when 9/11 happened. And it just happened to be that I had been in the field at Fort Campbell, Kentucky for a couple of weeks, and I had gotten very sick. I contracted viral meningitis, and they don't know if it was from being in the field for 3 weeks and getting bit by a mosquito. I wasn't the only one that came down with viral meningitis, but I had been home for about 3 weeks. My husband was sent home to take care of me. He was in training, but because I was not able to take care of our young son, his unit was able to send him home to take care of me. So when 9/11 happened, I was sitting on the couch. I was recovered from being sick, and I was sitting on the couch. My husband was sleeping, because this was very early in the morning. That was our rotation as parents. I was the early riser. He was the one who liked to stay up late. So he became the night feeder, you know, go to bed about 2 or 3 o'clock, and I would get up. So I was having coffee, sitting there, watching TV, and I saw it happen on TV like many of you. Did you guys see it on TV where you were watching? Unbelievable and unimaginable. Never in my life had seen anything like that. Being military, I knew that, okay, you know, I saw, you know, was getting the reports after the first plane hit. Literally saw that second plane hit the towers, and I knew something was going on, as most of you did. And I was feeding my son. He was a baby. I ran in, woke my husband up, and I was like, you got to get up, something's going on. And almost the time that he came and sat on that couch with his cup of coffee, our phone started ringing, right? So up until this point, both of us had served peacetime. Our military service was all peacetime, and it was all, you know, getting ready for at any point in time that we would have to deploy. And since at this time we were both at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, so Iraq was our main area that we were looking at, and always wargaming for where we were going to go. And so that was the little one in the middle. So my daughter was a product after my first deployment in support of global war on terrorism. She was born very, you know, within that time period after I came home, and was only, that was taken 3 weeks before he left. She was only 4 months old when he left for Iraq. So this is a little bit of an idea of where I've served. Primarily, our service was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and then, like I said, both him and I deployed, or we weren't deployed, we were assigned to Korea. He ended up being a little bit north in Camp Essions, and then I was stationed south in Pyeongtaek at Camp Humphreys. Amazing experience to be stationed overseas. Really got a great education on you know, what it was like to live in another government, another community, another lifestyle and culture. highly recommend it for anyone, and in fact, I encourage my adult children, especially when they were going to college, to please study abroad. It really opens up your mind, and also changes a little bit of what your views are with American democracy, a lot when you're living overseas. When I got back from supporting the global war on terrorism and he got done with training, we both transferred to Fort Drum. And that is where he was stationed with 317 Cav for his first assignment after his training. So like Ken, my husband started off as an enlisted service member. He was a scout, ground surveillance, radar, intelligence specialist, so he had to go out and implant sensors way ahead of any kind of expected action. And when he was in South Korea, he had rotations up to the DMZ to be able to replace those sensors as well while he was over there. And then he put in his warrant officer packet, and he went to warrant officer school and then to flight school to become a OH-58 Delta Kiowa Warrior pilot. The Warriors have since been retired. They were helicopters with big balls, small helicopters with big balls on the top. And their mission was to fly low and support ground insurgents, all of our ground troops that were out there, and make sure that they were well defended and to be able to provide reconnaissance. My deployment to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba lasted about 6 months, and like I said, we were there very early. That was a very unique experience because it was the first time, I've been told the first time, that the military intelligence specialists, whether they were interrogators or intelligence analysts, got to work with a lot of other three-letter agencies and work as collaborative teams to do research and analysis on the detainees that were in Guantanamo Bay, and then also participate in the interrogations. And before you ask, I was not involved in any kind of waterboarding. We never were allowed to work with CIA. So I cannot verify or deny anything that happened to that degree. Really, it was just a unique experience for me because as an analyst, I was doing some real world work, and I was able to use a lot of sources to try and build the jackets of who these detainees were and what kind of experiences they had before they were captured, what kind of information they could have had, or what we were looking for. Unfortunately, many of those individuals didn't really have a lot of information because of just the way that we fought, or they were fighting against us. They used a lot of low-level operators, and so we didn't get a whole bunch of information, not on my teams anyway. And so it was very interesting to be able to do that and get some experience working with a lot of those agencies. This one word has completely changed my life, completely. There's no other word in the English language that has had the most impact on my life. Overnight, many of those roles that I had had during active service had to go away. Overnight, I became a single mother. Overnight, I became a widow, which has defined my life as well. That is a day, I think, that as anniversaries come and go, that is probably one of the days that produces the most emotion in my body. Even sometimes I don't even realize it, and I'm starting to get a little bit more emotional or anxious or upset easily about certain things. And then when I look at the calendar, I realize, there's a lot of cues, physical cues, emotional cues, holiday cues that tell my body that it's coming around. The day my husband left for deployment, we had taken the baby to daycare because she was so young. She was only 4 months old, and we knew we were going to be there for hours as they were getting ready and saying their goodbyes and getting orders and just organized. And so our other kids were at school, and just so you know, we have 4 children. We were a blended family. Brian had our 2 oldest children, Taylor and Zachary, before I met him. So Brandon and Caitlin were our youngest kids, and they were my biological children. So they were at school, and we had only Brandon because the little one. He was just turned 3 earlier in December. And, we were all fine and saying our goodbyes. We had deployed multiple times. We had been on military training events where we were gone for a couple of weeks at a time. Brandon, the little boy in the middle, was 2 years old, from 4 months to 2 years old, before Brian and I ever lived back in the same house together. So either I was deployed and Brian had him, or my parents had Brandon because Brian was in training. But Brandon was 2 before we ever got back together in the same household. And when we finally separated and he left, I broke down. I broke down in the car with Brandon at that time, and I just busted out crying. Hysterically crying, ugly crying, right? Many of us women know ugly crying. And I didn't know why. I did not know why, but I really believe that your body knows, and there's some sixth sense within your body that knows that's the last time you're ever going to see somebody. And it took me a very long time to settle down from that, and then to just be present with my 2-year-old or my 3-year-old son that was there in the car with me, and take him to practice or to daycare. And then when I got the news, that was the day I knew. I knew why I broke down that day in that car. I knew why my body reacted the way it did, because it was literally the last time I ever saw him. Earlier that day, we had, talking about technology the other day, right? How we didn't have phones, and we didn't have a lot of technology that gave you the opportunities today like you can to see somebody instantaneously, even when they're overseas. So when we lived in Korea, they all had cell phones. We did not have cell phones in the United States. And when we got back, when Brandon was being born in 2000, we were getting beepers, right? Remember being cool, like the doctors wearing the beepers on your hips, and being able to, text your phone number to call me. And then, we had texting online, right? We could do some texting, like a chat box. Couldn't see each other instantaneously. So the only way we had to communicate was texting and by phone. And there were so many times when I would come home from work. I also had my nephew, who was 4 years old at the time, because my sister was deployed to Iraq. So I had our 2 little children, sometimes Taylor and Zachary when they weren't with their mom, and a dog, 2 cats, and then my 4-year-old nephew, because my sister was deployed. And so sometimes when I would get home in the evenings and he would try to call overseas, and I was just so overwhelmed with a crying baby and kids running everywhere and the dog needing to be fed and laundry and dinner and everything, it was short conversations, and I would say that was probably my biggest regret, is I was so tired and I was just so exhausted trying to live my life and trying to get through the deployment while he was deployed, because spouses at home have their own deployments, right? They go to single-parent households and try to do anything, and the service members are deployed. And then that day before earlier that day before he died, we had been texting on that online chat, and he had told me that they were not going to fly because the weather was so bad. And with the Kiowa Warrior helicopter, there's no technology in the helicopter to tell you where anything is, where the land is, where any of that is. You have to fly by sight. So generally, those helicopters do not fly when there's no visibility or very limited visibility. Obviously, they flew that night. They had to do the mission regardless of the weather. The pilots who came the night before and turned their mission around were reprimanded, so they had to fly that night. And so unfortunately, him and another pilot from the 101st, who was actually doing his last mission, he was rotating out of country the very next week, was killed with my husband in that accident. His wife was also serving in Iraq. She was not in his unit, but in a unit within their same area. So she knew right away because she heard it coming over the radio. My friends who were deployed from the 10th Mountain, so there's this guy called Lloyd Austin, who's our Secretary of Defense. He was our commander on the ground at the time for the 10th Mountain. He was my boss when I was serving in his headquarters at Fort Drum. So he was the commander on the ground for our unit. My unit, who was a military intelligence specialist, were over there supporting the operation, so my friends that I served with knew he had died. I found out through a phone call because we had just bought a new house, and somehow, some way, and those of you who served in the military know, sometimes the S1, which is the people who do the paperwork, like HR, sometimes things don't get put in the right place, annotated correctly. So pre-deployment, when we filled out all that paperwork and put the new house and the new information, it didn't get to the notifying team that came to notify. They showed up at the house of another spouse whose husband was deployed. All of our husbands were deployed and wives. She was 9 months pregnant. In the middle of the night, they showed up at her house to notify her that her husband was killed, but it was my husband they were talking about, not hers. Yeah, it was a cluster. It was just one incident after another after another. So they had to call me to find out where I lived in the middle of the night. And so when they did, I was groggy. I wasn't aware. Here's some strange voice asking me where I lived in the middle of the night. I didn't want to give that information to them. They couldn't tell me who they were. And so I roused myself out of bed, and I ran downstairs because they were saying they were here in my driveway. And I was like, you are not here in my driveway. There's nobody in my driveway. And so reluctantly, I gave them my address because I was becoming aware of what was happening. And because I had been sick, at that time, I had a lot of respiratory issues in the military, and that's a whole other story for another day that they never diagnosed, but I had already been sick with bronchitis and pneumonia. So my dad was staying with me that night. You know, God works in miraculous ways, and he's always put people in my life to get me through some of the most hideous, critical moments. And so my dad was staying with me to help me take care of our young children and my nephew. And once I hung up from them and realized what was going on, I ran upstairs and woke up my father and asked him to come downstairs, and I couldn't articulate why. I just said, you have to come downstairs, something has happened. And then I was also the family readiness group leader. So because I was a spouse, my husband was deployed, no one else wanted to take the position, I became the family readiness group leader. So I had all the binders that told us what to do and who to call if something happened to one of our troops overseas. And so I was getting out the book, and I was looking for the phone numbers to call our rear detachment commander. And when I called him, he said, we're on our way. So I absolutely knew what was going on, that they were coming to tell me that if they were coming to my house, that something had happened. And so, you know, they came and they delivered that information, and it just, like I said, it just changed everything. And then where do you go from there? And it's a situation that's going to make or break you. And it doesn't matter if it's a military death or an auto accident or a heart attack or where you are in your journey as a surviving spouse. It changes everything. And so what do? Where do you go from that point? And so the way that I heal is to put my big girl britches back on and to turn myself into professional and business mode and to figure out, A, how am I going to honor him in the best way that I possibly know how, and how am I going to get through with myself and these little kids afterwards. And so that's what I did. So my way of honoring Brian every single day of my life, and for the rest of my life, is to make sure that everybody knows his name and knows his story and knows who he was. And not only knows who he was, but who his children are, who his parents are, who his mother and father were, who his siblings are. Because when you're talking about family members that hardly ever get recognized, when we're talking about surviving families, it is the fathers hardly ever get mentioned or recognized. And it's always the siblings. Siblings never get recognized. but they are all part of that immediate family situation. You know, they're the ones who are recognized as Gold Star family members. As people age, generations die off, we have descendants. We have people who are named after our loved ones who have died, right? Their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews, you know, they are also family members, surviving family members, and need and deserve the same acknowledgement and respect as those of us who are living through it in the moment and lived with them. And we're not only emotionally tied to them, but also physically. And when you're talking about surviving spouses and children, and sometimes dependent parents, financially dependent on these individuals. They were our household members. They were our loved ones. And when they are gone, all three of those areas are gone with them. Not only did I lose my husband, I lost half of our income, right? I lost half of that ability to help me take care of my home, help me to provide for services and keep everything up that needs to be taken care of. So putting on my big girl britches, I got to work. It takes about a year for people to come out of that fog if you've ever experienced a death of a loved one. And so when that year, about the time that year came up, I went to work. And my first target was the casualty process. Because not only did the notification go horribly wrong, but so did how my husband came home from Dover. You know, my sister was serving in Iraq. She was 30 days from finishing her tour. And the Army and the Air Force did not put her on the plane with my husband, like Kate got to come home with her husband. As a sister-in-law of a fallen hero, she was not allowed on the plane to come home with him. You know why? Because she didn't have her Class A dress uniform. That's why she wasn't allowed to come home. Yeah. We gotta love it. I mean, sometimes bureaucracy is never good, right? So that was one of my bullet points, is that a family member should never be denied access to come home with their service member. Training of casualty assistance officers back in, this was 2004 when my husband died. Some of them were really great. Brian Batchelder, who was my captain who was assigned to Brian. He was a wonderful person. And he was wonderful in the fact that anything I said he did. He was a smart man to do that. So let me tell you, I didn't get to where I was because I was easy to deal with necessarily. And I was a very strong-willed woman. And not only that, I was a military sergeant first class. And let me tell you, there ain't no officer, sorry, Ken, that's not going to listen to me. I can tell you that. And he didn't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? This was his first experience. He had literally gotten a binder of information, maybe in our class at this time, and sent off to take care of this family who has just experienced this traumatic event, right? And so he did a wonderful job. Him and I worked really well together. But there were some that didn't have his motivation or ability or intelligence, whatever the word is you want to add in there. And so, you know, I wrote to them about the casualty process and about the training of assistance officers because I started to meet some of the other surviving spouses that had gone through the same thing, and I was hearing the same things over and over and over again. And so that program needed to be revamped. And they did. They did a wonderful job. The other thing is, I, as a surviving spouse and active duty military member, was not able to retain my career in the military upon my husband's death into a non-deployable position to allow me the opportunity to put my life back together and to stabilize our family and our household. And if I so choose, to not be put in the position of where I would deploy again. Now, this was my career. This was 9.5 years of my adult life that I spent in this career. Now, in 2004, had I been a surviving sibling, I would have been given that ability to be put in that position of non-deployable status so that I could retain my career, but not in 2004. So I see a lot of you in the room shaking your heads. What in the earth is going on there? So we learned a lot of lessons from prior eras, right? World War I, World War II, Korea War, where complete bloodlines were eliminated based off of that service, right? All brothers were serving, and in some instances, all brothers were killed. And so women have been serving right alongside them all along in different capacities, not necessarily in combat. But you had dual military couples, and in 2004, you certainly had a good percentage of dual military couples in the military. But the policies didn't catch up, and they were not cut up at that time. And so one time I was sitting next to General Cody, who was at that time the Assistant Chief of Staff for the Army, and he was my commander at the 101st that I used to brief. I was the only enlisted female soldier that was briefing him. I was the only enlisted that briefed him. And he said to me, him and his wife, at that time he had a son who was deployed to Iraq, he goes, why? Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. That wasn't a bomb. It's just me talking loud. Why didn't you come to me when this happened to you? I would have taken care of you. And I said, because if I would have come to you, you would have taken care of me. And I absolutely know that, hands down. He had the position, he had the rank, he had the ability. But would he have taken care of it for every single person after me? Would that have been a systemic policy change? And that's what we needed, is systemic policy change, so no one else had to go through that like I had to go through it. Also at that time, Brian unfortunately came home with some of his awards and decorations missing. Now, had I been a civilian spouse, I would not have known that. But because I was military and I was an E7, that was my job to inspect uniforms. So I knew there were things missing. At that time, they had no way to say for sure how that service member came home. If I'm at the place where he came home to and they prepared him in Dover, Maryland. Is Dover in Maryland? Delaware, thank you. So now they have to take a picture of the chest area so that they can see the awards and decorations, and that goes in their permanent file so that there's no question how that service member came home. So this was a 3-page analysis that I sent to an Army Casualty Affairs assistants. And I sent all these recommendations. Now, I'm not saying I'm the one who made this happen. I was a sea of voices, but I raised my voice. I added to all the individuals that were saying the same thing, so that they had the evidence that they needed, that change needed to happen. And so out of everything that I would ever say to anybody is, don't be ever afraid to lift your voice when something is not right. This gentleman here, James, was a service member that Brian and I both served with in the 101st. Katie and I, his wife, that time was active duty at the 101st. We went to pregnancy PT together with Brandon and her son, Bub. James brought Brian home from Iraq because they were serving together in Iraq. And because James had the closest relationship to Brian, he was able to bring him home. He was with us during that time. And on his 4th tour to Afghanistan, he was killed, leaving Katie and 2 children behind. His family, his parents live in Columbus area, so I do get to see them. We do get to work on some things together for surviving spouses. But I also honor him now and try to say his name every chance that I get. What does this mean? How do we honor it? When the government makes the decision that it's going to send troops overseas to fight the nation's wars or battles or defend democracy, because there's a lot of times that Congress authorizes action or the president authorizes action that it doesn't necessarily transmit into a war or conflict, right? And we still lose service members, our brothers and sisters overseas all the time. But what does that mean? What is the obligation of our country and of our society to ensure that this is fulfilled? And that's something, again, that's done really well in some respects and not done well in other respects. Abraham Lincoln set the standard, right? We're going to take care of those who have borne that battle, our brothers and sisters who come home with physical and invisible wounds. We should be taking care of them. We should be putting money towards that effort in the best way possible. They should have the best health care that is available in America. But unfortunately, only Congress can authorize that. And everyone sitting here in this room has a chance to ensure that they do that by lifting your voice and making sure that that's done. But then how do we take care of the surviving spouses and children that are the dependents of those fallen military heroes, right? The women and men like myself, surviving spouses, the children like our children. And in some cases, parents were dependents of those individuals while they were alive because of their maybe physical or medical conditions. How do we take care of them? And should we be taking care of them? Because if we don't, who's going to serve? What is the one thing that most of us military members are always told in order to put our lives on the line? The only thing we're ever told is they will take care of your family if something happens to you. That is what you are absolutely told. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So in the last couple of years, I will say it's been 20 years. This January was that anniversary that marked 20 years of not having my service member, not having my Brian in our family, providing for our family, loving our family, there for our children's graduations, our children's weddings, seeing his grandkids born. He was not there. And for 17 of those years, I was not able to get the annuity that was from his 10 and a half years of service, called the Survivor Benefit Plan in full. So in the military and in Congress's wisdom, for some reason we were not as equal to our civilian counterparts. If our service member died, the surviving spouse was not able to get their full annuity payment, which was 55% of what they would have earned or what they did earn over their lifetime. Insurance program, many retirees opt this to be able to provide for their surviving spouses had something happen to them. So for 17 of those years, I was not able to get that because of a law. In 2020, that law was finally eliminated. But it took 3 years for surviving spouses like myself to get that benefit in full. So this is a win. It took a long time to get there, even predated my experience as a surviving spouse. There was many surviving spouses who were predominantly women who worked on this before I was one. But in February 1st of 2023, just a year ago, was the first time I was able to get my husband's, or what would have been the annuity from my husband's earned income, his career, his employment to take care of his family. And by that time, our 4 children are already grown. That was money I really could have used to take care of them. But like I said before, working on that institutional change, it's going to matter for those who come after us. They will not have to suffer like those of us who were subjected to that are going to have to suffer. But that doesn't end there. Where else does the country need to step up and ensure that surviving spouses and children are taken care of? One thing is the medical and dental coverage. So if you don't know, surviving spouses lose their medical and dental coverage after 3 years. Now we can elect to provide additional coverage at a cost and a copay to be covered for medical and dental. So like I'm the surviving parent, and now I'm not getting the annuity that my husband earned with his life, but now I'm being forced to buy additional coverage or to pay additional money in order to be covered under medical and dental services, where civilian counterparts don't have that thrown onto them. Additionally, Surviving children can retain their medical and dental coverage at no cost, as they had when their father was alive. But once they reach age of 21, if they are not in university, they lose their medical and dental coverage. At age 23, regardless if they're in a university, they will lose their dental coverage. So first of all, you're telling military surviving children, and not just military surviving children, our military members and veterans, that their children are not as worthy as civilian children are. That they have two options. They can either go out and spend out of pocket to get those kids covered up to age 26, or they could go to a military program called Military Young Adult and pay $500 a month to get coverage for their children. And you're talking about the healthiest group of individuals in the country, ages 21 to 26. And they want us to pay $500 a month to pay for that coverage. And so in Congress right now, we have some bills that if you are interested in lifting your voice and helping these groups, these are the bills that you would have to contact your congressman on. The batteries. Thank you. Dependency and indemnity compensation. This is legislation that Congress put into place. Now, this is compensation from the country for the death of a service member due to their service. So, like my husband, who was killed in Iraq, or those who are killed in Afghanistan and other wars, or those who have died as a result of their service-connected deaths or service connection. So, like those individuals who have passed away because of Agent Orange, or any other reason that the service caused their death. A death is a death is a death, and it doesn't matter what your rank is. It doesn't matter how long you have served. So currently, the law is that everybody is equitably compensated, right? Years ago, those who, and it was a long time ago, it was rank-based. So if you were a colonel's spouse, then you were getting quite a bit more money than a private or a lower enlisted spouse. But because it is, the country is compensating the family, which is primarily surviving spouses, and sometimes children if there's no surviving spouse, for this benefit. And this is a benefit that for a child is not going to go throughout their lifetime. It's only to get them to the age of majority with where their parent would have normally provided income. And so this benefit has not been updated in 30 years. 30 years. But meanwhile, members of Congress are giving themselves raises, right? So this is something, now I will tell you, when you're talking about surviving family advocacy, this is a very small group of individuals. We're talking about maybe 60,000 spouses around the world that are surviving spouses of our American fighting forces. So this is a group of individuals that are easily ignored. We're trying to put our lives together, so we're not trying to advocate for our benefits 9 to 5 through the halls of Congress. Only crazy people like myself do this, and only because I've had the gift of having employers who have been very understanding, compassionate, and know it needs to happen. And the third thing is the remarriage penalty. These are the 3 priorities currently that are in Congress that are affecting surviving families. And in essence, Congress is telling me that I am not allowed to be remarried and maintain my financial security. So if I were to get remarried, I would lose all my benefits, unless, here's wisdom again, I was over the age of 55, I'm currently 50 plus, but not 55, then I could get remarried and retain my benefits.
but a young, unremarried widow. So for the last 20 years, I have not been able to get remarried and retain my financial security for myself and my children without a man. And so this is the only thing is we're trying to get this changed because civilian spouses don't have to live under these same conditions, and for some reason they put this on military spouses, surviving spouses. So who are we anyway? We're a collection of surviving spouses from around the country whose ranks are now more and more men are joining us to lift these messages as well, take care of themselves and their children, and really just trying to band together as much as possible so that we do have numbers and we can have a bigger voice, but we'll never have the big enough voice as we need without having other people like members of our military and veteran communities joining us, known as the Military Coalition, and also patriots across the country who love us and care about us and want to acknowledge that surviving spouses need to be recognized and they need to be included. This picture has my young children, the little girl sitting on the lap, and Brandon, who was the little one in the middle, during one of our congressional receptions on the Hill. So how can we honor the legacy of our fallen service members? First of all, including them in language goes a very long way. We worked very hard to get most of our military components to recognize surviving families and Gold Star families in any time that they're giving speeches, any time that they're having events, because someone mentioned here yesterday that the military's mission is to move and fight wars, right? Constantly moving forward, and to be previously to be bringing up surviving families, Gold Star families, is kind of a negative connotation, right? You're bringing up the fact that people could actually die while they're serving their country. But what they have seen over the last 20 years, especially since I've been a surviving spouse, is that it actually helps the military's mission to recognize and to honor and to acknowledge those families. And so when 2004, and this happened to me, had I been a civilian spouse living on a military base, I would have had 6 months at most to clear out and no longer be a part of the military's mission, no longer be connected to the military family. And for some spouses like myself, that was our life. That's who we were. That was our identity, is to be connected and part of that military family and community. So not only were they told that they had to leave base, find another place to live, be completely disconnected from a lot of places that they could still use their benefits, like shopping at exchanges or commissaries, which gave them a little bit of break of buying food or accessing medical services, but they had to leave completely. So they have totally eliminated that for the most part. They give the families, it's on their timeline, at least within that next year, to be able to put their lives back together and move on. But just including that word, anytime that you are doing a military or veteran promotion, goes a long way to changing the way that we have a relationship in society with surviving families. And when I say using surviving families, you're not only talking about the Gold Star families who have still military IDs and are eligible most times for the same benefits and services that our military and veterans are, because we are still dependents, but you're also including those extended families who would love to be a part of a military or veteran ceremony or event, but may not feel included just because you didn't put the words in the language of advertising for these events. And then actively supporting adequate benefit delivery. And so all of us in this room know that prices rise every single day. Things change, become more expensive, and there's no reason that benefits are not keeping up with that. Because when you take away somebody's livelihood. Just think about it in this room. If you lost half of your income to run your household, how that would affect you in every instance of your life, from maintenance of your home to putting food on the table to be able to afford utilities. It doesn't stop in one area, it affects everything. So making sure that these families have access and the ability to have parity with our civilian counterparts, and that our benefits are adequately resourced, just like we work very hard to make sure our military and veteran communities have that same option. And that's the end of my speech. Thank you very much.
Kimberly, thank you. That's a really important mission that you're on, and it's something that you've worked very hard over the past 20 years, and it's an important one. And it's extremely important, I think, for civilians and people who don't have ties to the military. I never obviously knew Brian, but the date of death, I was actually in Iraq the same day during that same time Brian was there. And during my deployment, we ended up losing 10 individuals to combat. So it's an important message. It's an important thing. And if you look on Kimberly's sweater, if you ever see, I've had people come up and ask me, what's that like purple thing with the gold star mean? And so you know that's what that is. It's a quiet, constant reminder for those of us who don't have someone that directly died to remind them of that. And why Gold Star families are dictated by relationship according to the law, there's my dad, come on up, Ken. My dad is named Eugene. Eugene is named after Eugene, his uncle that died in France. So we don't think about, like, what were the nieces and nephews and cousins that my dad lost growing up, right? So it just kind of shows how that impact goes on generation after generation after generation. So with that being said, we're going to move on. We have Ken Lane here. Ken was a chief in the United States Navy, so I got two E7s surrounded an E5, so this is not going to work well for me. So at any rate, we're going to start off basically with the same set of questions that we had yesterday. Kimberly already answered a couple of those, but we're still going to give her a chance to answer. But I'm going to start with Ken. Ken, tell me what your thoughts were of the military prior to going in and why you decided to go in, and what did you do while you were in?
Okay, well, first, good morning, and thank you for being here. And Kimberly, bless your heart.
Thank you.
Couple things. I didn't know anything about the military, okay? I went to St. Edward High School, which was a college preparatory high school, right? So I played hockey for St. Ed's, and my dream was to go to Bowling Green. Bowling Green was at the pinnacle of ice hockey in college. After my 11th knee scope, Bowling Green said, regretfully inform you that we're no longer interested. And it was strictly based on medical. So when I came home, it was the first time I've seen my dad cry. My dad was an iron worker, hard-working man. His insurance failed to pay for the 11th knee procedure, which was horrible. So when I came down the stairs, he looked at me and he said, you know what? I'm going to pay for any college you want to go to. And at that time, I was real big into art, so I wanted to go to the Pittsburgh Institute of Art. He agreed to that. And fast forward about 2 weeks, he said, have you ever considered the military? I said, absolutely not. Don't know anything about the military, was never inducted on the military, other than I knew my grandfather was in World War II on the Sable Island, one of the first aircraft carriers. But outside that, I didn't know anything. So 2 weeks later goes by, he said, what do you think about the military? So now I'm starting to get the picture. Fast forward about 10 days, he says, what do you think about the military? I said, I'm on my way down to the recruiters. And that's exactly what I did. 6:30 at night, I went down to the recruiters. There was a female recruiter. Her name was Diane Ellert. Diane Ellert, I said, I want to go in the military. When I first walked in, the Marine Corps was on my right, Navy was on the left, Air Force was straight ahead. Typical Air Force, he wasn't in his office.
Golfing or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, golfing. Marine Corps had probably 4 or 5 folks in there, so I wasn't going in there. So I went in, and there was nobody in the Navy office. So bottom line, that's why I went in the Navy. My grandfather was in the Navy, my dad was in the Navy. He went in as an E3, got out as an E1. I said, I don't think that's the way the military is supposed to work. He said, I couldn't figure out why it was wrong for me to salute my commanding officer with my middle finger. He did not take orders from people. So if you can see how I was raised. Not that I let my military career go that way, but it was my first learning point. So from there, we went down, we took the test. 9:30 at night, we're in my living room, or I'm sorry, in the kitchen. I was 17 years old. I was in between my junior and my senior year of high school. And mom and dad had to sign the papers. Mom refused. The kid's not going in. So after some convincing the recruiters kind of pulled her aside, got to talking to her, said, look, he's really interested. I think he's going to make an outstanding sailor. My dad did some talking to her, so finally mom was convinced, so she signed off on the documents. So I graduated on May 17th, 1985. I was in boot camp in Great Lakes, June 21st, 1985. When I went in, the Navy had a program called the Buddy Program. I tried to convince my best friend to go in the Navy with me. He wouldn't do it. 3 weeks before I was shipping out, he decided to go in the Navy with me. Well, the A school that I had, the school to become the profession that I wanted to be, I lost. So I went in as an undesignated E1. Okay, I should have been chocking and chaining airplanes on an aircraft carrier. Cleaning brass with the boatswain mates, right? Bottom of the barrel jobs. But no, my grandfather expired when I was in boot camp, World War II veteran. Because he did not raise me, I was not allowed to go to his funeral. A week after my grandfather expired, my best friend Tony, his grandfather expired. Him and his mom and his 2 sisters lived upstairs. His grandfather lived downstairs. He raised them. Tony got to go home on leave. We fast forward, I go off, Tony goes off, he goes to his school, I go to Airman Apprenticeship School. I show up to my first command, like I said, I should have been on an aircraft carrier. No, my grandfather was looking out for me. He sent me to San Diego, California, Coronado Island. If anybody's familiar with Coronado Island, one of the most beautiful places in the world, right? So here I am as an E1, fresh out of Cleveland, Ohio, never been out of Cleveland, Ohio. I'm in San Diego, September 1985. I get the word that I'm deploying January 1986, 3 months later. First stop that they put me in, Philippine Islands, Longapo City. We'll let your imagination go from there. I will tell you this, that beer was 7 cents a beer, okay? I'll leave the rest to your imagination. So to fast forward through my career, I don't know where Jacob's going with the questions, but I'll fast forward to my career. When I was an E1, I had to strike for a job because I was undesignated. I didn't have a job. So in order to make E4, you can go as an undesignated E1, E2, E3, but in order to take the E4 exam, you had to have a job, right? So I had to strike. I was going to take, I was just a young kid, so I'm following the money. So operations specialists in the Navy had a $20,000 re-enlistment bonus. So that's what I was doing. So I went back to the barracks that night, and like every other night, there was a keg of beer, there was a pool table in the lounge, and what transpired into people throwing pool balls at each other, beating each other with pool sticks, beer still flowing. I told my shipmates that I was going to become an operations specialist. I had 11 air traffic controllers in that room. All 11 of them pulled me aside. You're too good to be an operations specialist. We're going to make you an air traffic controller. So that's what we ended up doing. So I ended up striking for air traffic control, went to air traffic control school, graduated September 11th, 1987. Went back, the command that I was with actually sent me TAD. The Navy still had money. So command sent me just temporary to school. I was done with school, I went right back to San Diego. Called for my first set of orders. My first set of orders was Naval Air Station, Barbers Point. Anybody heard of that? Oahu, Hawaii. Horrible first duty station, right? So we fast forward from there. So I was there from 1989 to 1992. Called for orders, 1992 to 1995. I was in Lemoore, California. F-18 base. If anybody's familiar with military aircraft, that's the only thing that's on the base are F-18 Hornets. So we had dual runways, separated, center lines are separated by 9,600 feet. So we could run dual operations to the runways, right? So the runway on 3-1 right, we'd do that for departure runways, 3-1 left, we would run touch and goes when they came back. So I called for orders, your only mission in life at that point, let me go back to Barbers Point, one of the highlights of my career. As an E5, my senior chief pulled me aside and said, put your Camaro away. I showed up, when I re-enlisted, I bought a brand new 1989 Camaro, right? The only one they had on the lot was roll down windows and no air conditioning. I'm going, oh, why? What do I need air conditioning for, right? So I bought it, we go over there, first thing my senior chief tells me is park the car. I said, excuse me? He said, your number one mission in here is to get qualified. It's the only reason you get up in the morning to breathe is to get qualified. Park the car, I want to make you the Sailor of the Year. Didn't know what that meant. That's exactly what he did. Made me Sailor of the Year as an E5. That billet is essentially, it's not necessarily a billet, but that accolade is made generally for E6s, bucking to make chief, E7, as an E5. So I was not the most liked person on the base. But then we fast forward, right? One of my highlights of my career. 1992 to 1995, being in Lemoore, got tower supervisor qualified, but because I was only there for 3 years, I was not allowed to be radar qualified. So I called for a set of orders. My senior chief, one of my mentors, and God bless every one of them. The reason why I went in the Navy and the reason why I retired at the rank that I did was strictly 100% was the mentorship that I had. I listened to my chief petty officers, the backbone of the Navy. So in 1995, my senior chief pulls me aside. He said, pick an aircraft carrier. I said, excuse me? He said, you're going to an aircraft carrier. I need to get you qualified so we can start making you put your package together and make chief. So I got orders to USS George Washington. So that's what's unique about the Navy. We can talk to airplanes and separate airplanes on land, right? That's the easy part. Air Force does that, right? The Navy, our runway moves. When you're out at sea, it's a whole different ball game, ladies and gentlemen. I've got shirts in my closet right now that have permanent sweat stains in the armpits of them because every night recovery was the first 3 airplanes were emergency fuel. Emergency fuel means they have 2 options. Either one of my 2 tankers in the air tank them, and if they don't, they either get diverted generally since we're underway, it'll be an outside base. But then we go into what we call blue water ops. There's no land facility. You have to land on board the carrier. So I got fully qualified there. Leave there 1995 to 1998. Where did I go from 95 to 98? I don't recall. Anyways, we'll come back to it. But I'm going to save the rest of this story onward as far as advancement and that sort of thing. If Jacob brings that up in question, hint, hint.
You want to talk about you were military intelligence?
Yes. So the reason I went into the military is I didn't go in right out of high school. I thought I could make it on my own. At the time, I was living in South Hadley, Massachusetts with my mom and my stepdad. All my family was military, and I just thought I could get a job and go to work, and that obviously didn't happen. So my mom was working in a factory, and she was like, this is great job, good work, good money. And I worked that job for about 6 months, dumping plastic bottles into a bin for 8 hours as a temporary worker. And I'm not saying anything about factory workers. Everybody's got their place, but that was not for me. I grew up on a farm, and I loved being on a farm, and I loved physical work and outdoors. And all of my family was military. My daddy, who was stationed in the Philippines as well, He wasn't a Vietnam vet, but he also couldn't take orders very well, so he didn't last very long in the service in the Army, and he would have been one of those soldiers that I would have probably permanently had in the front leaning rest. But I had a aunt who was a Marine at the time, and she's retired now, and I always looked up to her. I always thought she was tough, and she always talked such good stories about her military experience. So I did tell my mom that I wanted to be paid for what I know, not necessarily what I do. So I did want to go to school, but my parents didn't have the money to send me to school, and they weren't going to pay for it. And back in those days, in the early 90s, there wasn't a lot of mechanisms, for financial aid like they are now. So I went into the military, and that's what pretty much got me there. But when I went to my recruiter, I took the ASVAB, and he said, well, you could pick whatever job you want. You didn't, I guess, based off how your scores, maybe what they're going to tell you you're going to do. And he goes, so what you want? And I said, well, I want a job where I could get advanced really quickly, and I didn't have to work in a predominantly female environment, and that, because I wanted more money and I wanted rank, so I didn't get told what to do all the time. And he said, well, you want military intelligence. And that's where they put me.
I'm trying to think on how, when you deployed, what was your experiences being deployed? What were the hours like? What did you do? What kept you motivated? Either way.
So my deployments were a little complicated because in between having children, you can't deploy for a certain amount of time. So my unit had were already going somewhere else, and I was still in that maternity leave. But when I came out of that, there came up an opportunity for one soldier to go on a special mission or deployment. I can't remember even how they said what we were doing. And so I was the only one that was able to go because everyone else was already tasked. And I was looking forward to it because to that point, after having Brandon, I wasn't included with my regular unit, so I really wanted to do something. And so when I left into our training, we still didn't know where we were going. They weren't going to tell us until we were ready to leave, and it was individual assignments. We were all going somewhere different. And then they told me I was going to Guantanamo Bay. So I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really know anything about Guantanamo Bay, and I didn't know much about what they were doing there either, till they gave us the briefings. That was a pretty sweet assignment, I am not gonna lie. Probably a little bit tropical, like some of the places you find, nice and warm, great water, beaches. Couldn't leave the post because it was Cuba, but it was pretty nice. So that particular deployment was I was very happy to be there, no lie. And I really enjoyed the mission. So sometimes I was on a swing shift, sometimes I was on a day shift. It just depended on what we were doing at that particular time. So usually in the military and the Army, I was always in the field, and that was no fun in the middle of nowhere in the Army. So that was my only real tropical assignment that I really enjoyed.
My assignments, as far as Navy goes, really your only deployment cycle is when you're on sea duty. So each rate in the Navy has what we call sea-shore rotation. Okay, and air traffic controllers, we were 3 years sea, 5 years shore, right? Because each ship only takes so many air traffic controllers. So on an aircraft carrier, we only have approximately 42 air traffic controllers. Now understand something, there's only 2,300 air traffic controllers in the entire United States Navy. There's 330,000 sailors. That gives you any idea. So the amount of air traffic controllers that can go, and then that's based on pay grade as well. So you can only have one chief, one E7. Generally, you'll have one E8. If you're fortunate enough, you'll have an E9, a master chief. But a little background on E7 through E9 in the Navy. And I don't know if it's the same way in the Army or not, but in the Navy, by law, 3% of the Navy total can be paid at the chief petty officer level, E7. 2% of the entire United States Navy can be paid at the E8 level, senior chief. And only 1% in the entire United States Navy can be paid at master chief E9.
Oh,
That's enlisted. Yep, so you go E1 through E9 are your enlisted ranks. Generally, the way they're separated, at least in the Navy, E3 and below are their own. So if we'll fast forward to after I got commissioned, and we'll go into that story here in a second, but my goal was I never opened my mouth for the first 90 days until I talked to my sailors, okay? I would talk to my sailors at the E3 and below. I'd put them in a conference room and I'd talk to them. My E4s, I'd talk to them on their own. My E5s, my E6s, and I would pull my chiefs aside if I was fortunate enough to have a chief, right? Because again, you only have so many chiefs to go around. And we need it, and the old theory in the Navy is the only time you're gonna make rank is if you're underway, right? Because that's what we do, we're sailors, right? So I would pull them aside and I would get firsthand exactly what was going on with the command. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't, I just asked questions. Talk, collar devices are off. Just you and I talking. And that's the way we did it very well. And I would always leave them with one saying, and I learned this from Lou Holtz. For those that don't know who Lou Holtz is, he's my favorite football coach, college football coach, okay? Hard-nosed, little guy, 5'4", weighed $110, maybe soaking wet, right? But he spoke with authority. And he's got 300-pound offensive linemen that listen to him and will follow him into battle if he had to go, right? But he always said one thing. He said, it's never right to do the wrong thing, and it's never wrong to do the right thing. And I've lived with that it's ever since the first time I listened to him. So as far as deployments go, if you're not underway, if you're not on sea duty, the Army and the Marine Corps were just getting beat up. They were getting, I mean, just literally getting beat up. They were doing 9-month, 12-month, sometimes 18-month deployments. Turn around for 90 days, you're right back in that cycle. So imagine what home life is like, right? So finally, the powers that be got together and said, you know what, these other branches are gonna have to start sharing this load. So the Navy came up with what they call an individual augmentee. So my IA tour was, I went to be an instructor at what the Navy calls knife and fork school, chief warrant officer and limited duty officer. Air traffic controllers, we do not have chief warrant officers. We only have limited duty officers. So what that means is, as an LDO, you were prior enlisted, you applied for the program, you get accepted, you become an ensign in E1 in the Navy, but you got a whole bunch of chest candy. So your typical ensign coming out of the Naval Academy and me showing up at the ship at the same time is night and day, okay? For those that don't understand, I've got 18 years in the Navy, he's got his 4-year education and is still blowing his nose. Okay, so it's just night and day. It's two different things. So when the command gets my orders and says Ensign Ken Lane is showing up at the ship, they're ready for me. Oh, we got another ensign, another snot-nosed kid coming out of the Naval Academy, right? And then you show up, and then that fun begins. But yeah, so my individual augmentee employment, my IA deployment was to Djibouti, Africa. And Djibouti, Africa it's not even a third world country, it's a fourth world country. It is beyond horrible. It's 154 degrees there every single day. 127 degrees air temperature, and then you start doing what we call the wet bulb effect. You start putting in barometric pressure, you start putting in humidity, the whole bit, and I would walk by the medical facility every day. So understand, the Navy spent $1 million on bottled water. Every 25 foot, there were these big green wooden coolers. And every 25 foot, you took 3 or 4 bottles of water. That was just to your walk from here to probably where we're parked, about 3 blocks up the road. President Bush came out and said that there's no bases in Africa. Why? Because there was no pavement. All the roads on the camp, the name of the camp was Camp Lemonnier, and it was a French-owned camp in World War II. And because there was no paved roads, there were just dirt and rock. That's why we got away, that's why President Bush got away with not calling it a base. It was literally a camp. So those experiences over there we can save for another time. Go ahead and move on.
What's unique about where you guys are at and the time period you served, you have a foot in both the pre-9/11 world and the post-9/11 world. So I'm really interested in seeing what did you see different in post or pre-9/11, post-9/11?
I will definitely say that one thing in a pre 9/11, which I really appreciated about the environment, especially in the military, is I believe we were heads and tails further ahead than our civilian workforce counterparts, because we were constantly being talked to about diversity and equal opportunity and sexual harassment. And, so as a woman in that environment, I was much more harassed in my own experience, not compared to anybody else's, in civilian workforce than I ever was in the military. And I also believe that the leadership that I had, and I always say this, even within my own family and in my own workspaces now, is the leadership sets the tone for the environments that you work in. And the leadership that I had in the military was amazing, and they always set the standard for you to follow. And I was in some pretty difficult positions. So during my peacetime service, when we were doing all training at the 101st, I was assigned to the 502nd Infantry Brigade, and I was one of the first females that was working and, when I say deployed, in field with all infantry soldiers and working out of their infantry talks. And this was back in the 90s. So there was a lot of experiences coming out to that, is just even how to handle those kinds of relationships, and having women in environments that we were not in necessarily before. Post 9/11, I would say that we're very aware of threats in the world. I believe that we're more hyper vigilant, even in our military postures. And keep in mind, I got out, and I don't know if I said this earlier, but my husband was killed in 2004, which was very soon after 9/11. And I ended my military career within that year. So I was out by November of 2004. So my experience is a little limited, but we were definitely more aware of what was going on. And the positive environment that came out before I left the military is we were considered general support as military intelligence. So all of your logistics and your supply corps and anybody who wasn't part of like the infantry were general support. And our guys and gals would come back from deployment and turn right around like 3 weeks later and be gone with another brigade. And so they changed the alignment of our unit structures to make us direct support to those units, so that we were not getting deployed constantly. And on that note, I will say that I find women who are serving have a higher rate of ending their careers early and not reaching retirement because of their responsibilities for families if they have children. And that's a real disgrace to our military, because it's predominantly women that are ending their careers early and not reaching that full retirement advantage that some of our male counterparts are able to make to continue their careers.
Absolutely. I'd love to feed onto that. And that was one of my notes while Kimberly was talking. She brought up the point about how she went about not necessarily defending herself, but what she had to do to get promoted, right? Because you had to be better than your male counterpart. I was fortunate enough to be in probably a pretty close to a 50-50 male-female ratio rate in the Navy. Here's what was ironic about me. When I first became an air traffic controller, my first duty station in 1989, that being Barbers Point, Hawaii, I was one of 4 guys in a 64-person division. So you do the math. We ran 2 crews. We ran a blue crew and a gold crew. And then out of those crews, we would provide 2 controllers up in the control tower for a mid-watch, but that was only if there was an emergency and somebody had to land after midnight, right? So the blue crew would be on during the day, the gold crew would be on, I think we took over at 15:30 or 3:30 in the afternoon, and we'd run till 11 o'clock at night. But when I first showed up into my crew, I was assigned, I don't remember the blue or gold crew, but Cheryl Arbogast, she was a first-class petty officer. She was an E6. She was our section leader. I was the only guy in that entire crew, right? We had 31 female air traffic controllers. I was the only guy. And and I'm going to tell you this, and please don't take offense, but this was my in-dock speech when I first checked in. She welcomed me to the crew, and she said, Ken, the only thing you have to worry about is our PMS dates are on a different day. That was how I was inducted into the Navy. And what I thought was a female-dominated Navy, right? I didn't know any better. But that was absolutely right. You know, you read back the old movies and you see the posters, the gals hanging in the guys' lockers or out at sea hanging on the walls of where their racks were on the ship, right? None of that garbage was around when I went in. And I don't know when that transition started. I can only take you from 1985 forward. But in my experience in the Navy, if I were to tell you, I'm not afraid to tell you that the female air traffic controllers are better than the men, without a doubt. Now, we all have our hiccups, right? And it kind of what it boiled down to was you had folks that were extremely good and book smart air traffic controllers, but once they plugged that headset in and an aircraft or a pilot called them up on frequency, they would freeze. So that's what really made the transition. But I was born and raised. My mentorship, my first tower chief was Michelle McLean, and she took me under her wing, and we ran with it. I mean, it was just dynamite. I have nothing negative to say. My career was basically modeled around female air traffic controllers. So I have nothing good to say. I mean, nothing but good to say about my experience as far as male-female relationships, and obviously the sexual harassment, that sort of thing. Thank God in my 28-year, 10-month, and 7-day career, I did not have one sexual harassment. Even as I got senior and I became a supervisor, I never had that. I had one incident on the ship, but I had a female, what we call LPO, a leading petty officer. She was an E6, and she was responsible for female berthing. And one of my female controllers, a young gal, E4 in the Navy, came out and said, hey, I got out of this woman, this gal she was from another division, but there was only so many places on the ship that they had female berthing. And I think there was only 3 of them. Well, one of them was right outside our workspace. And she came to me and she said, this woman keeps following me into the shower. Next thing she knows, she opens up her rack curtain and the female is laying naked in her bed. And she's like, well, what do I do? And I said, well, where's your LPO? I don't remember her name now. She's a master chief still in the Navy now. But thank God, that was the only one that I really ever had to really get my nose into. But yeah, as far as my experiences, you'd be talking to the wrong guy as far as looking for stories, good and bad, that sort of thing, because I have nothing but good things to say. So in my opinion, the military, especially in the Navy, we took it head on, and I think we solved a lot of problems before they even reared their ugly heads.
I wanted to ask a question specifically, Kimberly. The picture you had up here on the left-hand side, it was your DA photo. Tell us what was going on in that photo. If y'all remember it, Brian and her were on one side, and it was a very posed picture in her uniform. You want to talk about it? It's an interesting story, and why you felt you had to do what you were doing.
Yeah. I would say, you know, as a woman, we have to be very strategic with how we operate in male-dominated environments. And so very early on, I learned how to play the game. So in that photo, I'm actually 7 months pregnant. And, but of course, my normal uniform, my normal dress jacket would not fit, and I was being considered, I was having to prepare my, my packet for promotion for E7. And at that time, you had a committee who looked over all of your records, right? And it had a photo, so they could see who you were, what your gender was, what your race was, all of that, and make, in my opinion, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, we're all judgmental when we first see somebody. And because I did not want them to be biased against me for being pregnant, which that's a bias in the military, you know, and I heard it say here yesterday that, you know, you have some women who you work with that were really great, and you have some women that you worked with that were not so great. And I would say the same for my male counterparts. But there are certain personalities who are made for military life and certain personalities who are not. I believe I was made for military life, so I knew how to play the game. So I went and got a bigger jacket, had it sewn on, had my picture taken, so that's the picture that they would see in my packet, and not wear those hideous, awful pregnancy dress uniforms that were mentioned yesterday that we had originally to wear. And so even throughout my whole career, in order to get promoted or to fight for promotion against my male counterparts, I had to do things like that that were well within regulation, but I had to fit it for the situation that I was facing. And one other one that I do want to mention really quick is when I was being considered for promotion to even E6, which was right before the E7, I had went in there with my what we call the Love Me book. It's a binder that we keep all of our certifications, awards, decorations, and data, right? We keep this in a binder so that when we come up for promotion, we can discuss that with our leadership. Well, I didn't even stay in that office for 5 minutes with my first sergeant that we call Top. He didn't look at my book. He did not even have a conversation with me. I walked in and he said, "I don't feel that you're ready to go to the E6 board." Meanwhile, he's sending all these substandard males that had way more time than me, but they were not squad leaders, and I was a squad leader. They did not have the awards and decorations that I had. They did not have the marksmanship that I had or the PT scores, but he's sending these gentlemen, if I could say that loosely, to the board and not me. And I was like, whoa, 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 right? So I walked right out of his office. Well, a couple weeks later, I come back in there, and I'm pregnant. I find out I'm pregnant, and at that time, they had to counsel you as a woman, and you had to make the decision before you even had your child whether or not you intended to stay in the military or get out. They had to plan. And I was like, I'm just going to get out. And he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, because I don't feel like my career is going in the direction it needs to go. And he goes, well, what are you talking about? I said, what happened in that meeting? He goes, well, you misunderstood me. I'm like, nah, I don't think I did. And do you know, he decided then that all of a sudden I could go to the board. So by the time I got to the board, I was already like really huge, like 8 months pregnant with Brandon, and I got the highest score on the board even with the guys who went with me. So I always tell my female soldiers, don't take that first response that you get back, don't take it personally. Be smarter, be faster, be more strategic in your actions. You don't have to hate them, you just gotta learn how to play the game. And that's part of what I was so successful in the military.
So, unfortunately, we didn't get to all the questions we wanted to today. That being said, we gotta wrap up. So, does the audience have any questions on what they experienced, what their thoughts are? Yeah.
It would be really helpful if you would explain things like what a DA photo is. Some of the initials that you're using are way above my head, so that would be really helpful when you're presenting to non-military audiences. Secondly, Kimberly, it sounds as though the rug was pulled out from you when your husband was died. And I'm wondering if the military has life insurance policies on people who are deployed to wars.
Good question. So for your first thing, a DA stands for Department of the Army. So because I was in the Army, I was getting a DA photo. Second question is, yes, we do have life insurance. It's called the Service Members Group Life Insurance. And so service members can put who they would like to receive that life insurance. My husband did have me as his life insurance receiver, but not all service members do that or update their paperwork as it should be. So sometimes service members, even if they were recently married or had been married for a long time might have just neglected to do that
Mom
and
and dad.
have mom and dad still on their paperwork, or, I mean, there's a lot of stories. So yes, there is life insurance available. Good
And-
question.
And what she means by that also, like when I went in, I was 18, unmarried, so mom and dad were who they were. And I didn't get married, but a lot of guys did, and they never bothered to update, the spouse. And if you met your spouse in Germany, and mom and dad never met the spouse, and mom and dad's getting the money, there might be some hard feelings or what have you. Another thing, and this happened, Staff Sergeant Peterson, I served with him in Iraq. He ended up dying in Iraq. And about a couple weeks before he died, he got a letter from his wife that said she had found a better man while he was deployed. And she was engaging him, let's say. And so divorce paperwork was started, but by the time he died, it was just started. I remember going up to the command sergeant major afterwards, and I said, you know what really stinks about this whole thing? She's going to get his entire life insurance. And Sergeant Major, and I was joking with Ken, if you've ever seen We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and that scene where the sergeant walks past the Sergeant Major and says, beautiful morning today, Sergeant Major. And Sergeant Major goes, how do you know what kind of goddamn morning it is, right? That was sort of the Sergeant Major that I had. And he never really laughed, but he was standing there, he goes, yeah, she's gonna be pretty mad. And I said, why? She's getting all this money. Nope, day before he died, we took him and we changed the whole life insurance to from his wife to his mom and dad. So there's, it's those type of things you don't really think about. But
Good question.
yeah. Guys, I want to thank you for coming this week and having us. I learned a tremendous amount. I hope all of you that have come, I've seen a couple of the individuals here every day. So thanks for coming. If you want to see something like this in the future, let John and I know. John and I went to high school quarter century ago now. So go Perkins Pirates, right? So thanks for having us, and have a great rest of your summer.
Thank you.